Well, hello everyone. I am really delighted to be here to kick off the J. Edward Rall Cultural Lecture and Fireside Chat. Welcome everyone. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Vince Cerf, a true pioneer in the digital world. But first I will note that the annual NIH Rall Cultural Lecture is held in honor of Dr. J. Edward Rall, who helped to define the modern intramural research program at NIH. In the 1950s, he established a stable, academic-minded, and culturally rich community within our rapidly expanding government agency. Dr. Rall was known as a consummate scientist, a very charismatic mentor, and a Renaissance man. And it is he who recommended in 1984 that NIH add a cultural lecture to its Director's Lecture series to enrich our scientific community. I am truly delighted that Dr. Cerf agreed to be our speaker this year. His title is Vice President and Chief Internet Evangelist for Google. He will talk to us on the topic of the promises and perils of AI in biomedical research and healthcare delivery. This is a topic, as many of you know, that is very close to my heart. Before I came to NIH in 2022, I was a surgical oncologist and researcher in Boston. Over time, I became increasingly involved in leading clinical trials and worked on efforts to integrate standardized biomarkers in trials, a complicated enterprise trying to mix basic science endpoints, including complex genomics and clinical data. And now we have yet another complex horizon for us, that is that of using electronic health records as well as machine learning for clinical research. At NIH, I very much hope for all of us to work together to deliver evidence-based healthcare to all people. And I'm very excited about how new techniques in machine learning and artificial intelligence can help us advance toward that goal. So, of course, I, like all of you, am very much looking forward to hearing Dr. Cerf's insights on this topic. Dr. Cerf has been at Google since 2005 and contributes to global policy development and continued standardization and spread of the Internet. Previously in his career, he worked at MCI, the Corporation for National Research Initiatives, and DARPA. He is widely known as the father of the Internet, having co-designed the Internet's architecture and the TCP/IP protocols, the sets of rules for message formats and procedures that allow machines and application programs to exchange information. He has received too many awards to list here today, but I will name a few notable: the U.S. National Medal of Technology, the Alan Turing Award, the Presidential Medal of Freedom, member of the British Royal Society, and recently the Marconi Society Lifetime Achievement Award. He serves as an advisor to U.S. government agencies, including the NSF, NASA, the Department of Defense, Energy and Commerce, and I hope us. He holds a Bachelor of Science degree in mathematics from Stanford and a Master of Science and PhD degrees in computer science from UCLA, as well as many, many honorary doctorates. So I very much look forward to hearing Dr. Cerf today, and then also to our conversation, which will occur after this talk, which will also go over some of the questions that all of you have submitted. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Cerf.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today. I consider this an extraordinary honor. I'm not sure that I deserve it, but, I'll take it anyway. I'm excited about what we are going to talk about, But I need to warn you ahead of time that I'm not necessarily the world's best expert on artificial intelligence. I'm a networking guy. But I work for a company at Google where we've made investments in artificial intelligence for quite a long time. Major progress has been made, especially in machine learning, which is a third form of artificial intelligence. The term was developed in the 1960s by John McCarthy and his colleagues at MIT. And then they started out with kind of heuristic programming, which roughly speaking meant sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. If it works all the time, that's engineering. If it doesn't, that's artificial intelligence. Then they had some more organized technology called expert systems. These are roughly speaking collections of if-then-else phrases, if this, then that. And they would create large numbers of these if-then-else phrases. They would trigger each other. If this condition holds, then you should go do that. And if you did that, then some other condition would show up, and you would keep training your way through. The problem with that is that as the number of if-then-else phrases got big, the system started to be inconsistent and in some cases colliding with each other. So it didn't scale all that well. So then the next thing that happens is what we now call neural networks. They had their origins in the 1960s, but the neural network was only one layer deep, and it didn't do very much. And in fact, McCarthy and some of his, actually Minsky and Papert at MIT, wrote a book called Perceptrons, which basically trashed the idea of neural networks on the basis of this one layer deep perceptron. And that invoked a nuclear winter for a period of about a decade. But there were some people who hung on and said, if we could build a much deeper network, we ought to be able to capture more state information that would allow us to detect and sense correlations that would be of interest. And that's where we have come as a result in machine learning. Now, all of you, I'm sure, have been exposed to one of the aspects of machine learning called large language models. And I suspect we're going to get into this during our discussion. But I will tell you that today's large language models are simultaneously unbelievably and unexpectedly brilliant and equally confusing. In fact, I look a little bit like Sigmund Freud, and so I've been thinking of recording a little video. Well, what we have now is the artificial id and the artificial ego, and what we are missing yet is the artificial superego to control the uncontrollable impulses of the artificial id. And if I had one, I'd hold up a cigar and say, well, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. So what is important, though, for you to know is that quite apart from the large language models and the kind of hallucinations that they exhibit, they still show remarkable capability. There is something going on in those models that imply a lot of semantics or hiding in the statistics of word relationships. That's how these things work. They generate output based on the statistical relationship of words occurring adjacent to each other or some distance apart. But those words have come from something that had meaning. And so there is a ghost inside the large language model. And we don't fully understand or appreciate all that it can do, but we know that there are some things it doesn't do well. So the consequence of that, however, should not distort your understanding and appreciation for what will be possible here at NIH when it comes to gathering large amounts of data, understanding correlations that are exhibited by that data, and then looking for the causal model that will explain what those correlations are. And that's some of what I hope we'll get to talk about this afternoon. So I'm going to stop here with my little sermon, which is what chief internet evangelists do, and let's get started with our discussion. Now, I need to warn everybody, I wear hearing aids, and I don't know how good or bad the acoustics are here, so I'm going to put a headset on. I am not listening to the latest football game. At least I won't admit even if I were. I'm hoping to get good quality sound because I would like to make sure I hear the questions. So here we go. Oh, and I have to adjust my hearing aids in the process. There we go. And the theory is I can hear you well. Let's try that.
You ready?
Yeah, I am ready.
Excellent.
Well, I don't know if I'm ready, but I can hear you.
All right, excellent. Okay, here we go. Well, welcome, Dr. Cerf, and thank you for joining me to this conversation. A major problem with healthcare is that actually very, very little of it is based upon rigorous clinical data.
Oh my God, that's scary as hell.
Isn't that scary? So, and just to give you an idea, a rigorous analysis of, at least I know from the fields of oncology and cardiology, about between 5 and 10% of the decisions that are made in the clinic are actually based on randomized trials. That's it.
Can I get a change of underwear now?
Exactly. So it really is frightening, and it does say something about the neural net that is the human brain of a doctor, that our clinicians really are able to put together these really diverse collections of data, including their own personal experience, and come up with something that really does improve people's health to a great degree. So we're not going to denigrate the contribution of the human brain or the experience of a clinician.
Yes.
Those are really critical, but we all think we can do better. We can introduce better data to make better decisions.
It just occurs to me that it's a good thing that this is called the National Institutes of Health and not the National Institutes of Disease, because I don't know if anybody would fund that.
Exactly. So, my biggest ambition as NIH director is to produce more evidence-based, data-driven healthcare across the world.
I love that.
Available to every patient. And I would like everyday visits to the doctor. This is the other important part. Everyday visits to the doctor to contribute to our evidence base.
Yes. Oh, actually, so now this is a conversation. This isn't just going to be Q&A. And I'm going to throw away the question. Okay, so visit to the doctor. If I were a doctor and my patients only came in when they had symptoms and they were sick, my statistics would say my patient is always sick because I never see them when they're well. So one of the things that's very important, I think, is for us to, in terms of evidence-based medicine, is to collect information about my patients when they're well also, so I have some sense for what's normal for them. And that will help me figure out whether they have gone in some excursion away from the norm. So instrumenting ourselves might turn out to be very beneficial for ourselves and for medicine in general. And I'm not sure what kinds of instrumentation we might want, but you'd know that better than I do. But I do think we should think about that. We need to understand people's state of affairs when they're healthy as well as when they're not.
Couldn't agree more. And so many of our diseases that emerge are present far, far before even the patient is aware of them. I mean,
symptoms.
We could name so many. And this is another hope that somehow collecting better data might help us uncover things that maybe even the patient doesn't realize.
This is so, oh God, I love you to hear you say this, because think about our medicine up until the point where we had the ability to do DNA sequencing, and it was based on just observations, and we were getting data, we were getting blood tests, and we could get, urine samples and all these other kinds of things. But the DNA sequencing led us to think that that was the top of the mountain. Once we got that, we knew everything we could possibly know, and then we discovered proteomics, and then after that we discovered metabolomics. And your point, though, which is I take very seriously, is that we can capture information that later will tell us a correlation. We might discover After we discover that the patient has an illness or a disease, we can look back at the data that we collected and say, is there anything, any correlation in there or causal model that we can associate with it? And that would speed up our ability to recognize medical conditions, wouldn't it?
Absolutely, and those are the data sets we lack today. We don't have a longitudinal record. Oh, we do in some. We do have some really wonderful long-term observational cohorts, but we have it in pieces.
Yeah.
And we don't have them for everyone and the diversity that we need. So we're not even on to our first question yet, okay?
No.
See what I mean? Okay, so let's do our first question, and this fits with what we've been talking about. What do you see as the challenges and opportunities on this front, basically for making healthcare truly evidence-based?
Well, we just talked a little bit about that, and I think, as I imagine, all of us are not stationary, and so we move around, and as we move around, we go to different doctors, different clinics and hospitals. Our health records are scattered all over everywhere. Some of them are still on paper, in fact, maybe most of them. And so the system isn't contributing to evidence as we would like it. So one thing we might collectively work on is how to capture that evidential information and make it coherent and collected in some sense. Now, a lot of people are very nervous about personal information, and HIPAA is with us. And in a funny way, it may be inhibiting our ability to do evidence-based medicine. So maybe we should rethink that and recognize that each of us has the opportunity to contribute to a larger database of health knowledge and clinical knowledge that would actually help everyone, including ourselves.
And one of the things we talked about at one point in the team was, what if every time someone came into the doctor's office with this particular disease, diabetes, we'll just pick that, they could be asked to be part of a clinical trial, and they may say yes, they may say no. But what if everybody who has diabetes is part of the data collection? And the ones who, so now you have large observational cohorts
Yes.
with the clinical trials nested within them and the ability to look at the difference. And one of the most critical things that we all think are understanding is who says yes to the trial and how different those people are, than people who have the same disease.
Yeah,
right?
Good point. Yes, but this is very relevant to me. My two brothers are diabetic, so that would be really a helpful thing to do.
Okay. How do you think AI and machine learning will help make the connections we need between the bench and the bedside, practically?
Well, as a practical matter, what we've learned about machine learning is that it's capable of ingesting an unbelievable amount of data and then discovering relationships. Now, sometimes those are not they're not causal, and they're just happenstance. But where we can identify a causal model, then having collected all that data gives us confidence that the causal model is let's say, accurate. It's useful for predictions or for diagnosis. But right now, we do not have a regular practice of accumulating that information and putting it into a form where we can perform those kinds of machine learning algorithms. So we may have to find methods by which people have incentive to participate in the data collection program. And you just suggested some very interesting ways of doing that. And I think if people understood that sharing of that data is almost as important as giving blood, knowledge is really important.
So technically, do we have the level of technology that allows us to do this with enough security and safety to convince people to give up to contribute their health data? Like, let's say somebody has a disease that has some stigma associated with it. Of course that would, give them pause. Do we have the technology to allow that level of security, and can some of these algorithms help us with that?
Well, I'm pretty sure the algorithms can help, but I will say that it's software. And software has bugs, and bugs get exploited. So, and when people wave the cryptography flag around, which is not unreasonable, we can protect data from exposure, but sometimes the bugs get past some of those mechanisms. We spend an awful lot of time at Google doing everything we can to keep data from being exposed other than to authorized parties. We make heavy use of cryptography to do that. We insist on two-factor authentication and other kinds of methods. So I think the answer is the technology exists to protect the information, but it has to exist everywhere where the protection is needed. And so there's still work to be done.
Yeah, unfortunately. Okay. Here's a new one. You're known for standardizing information to allow for more widespread communication. What are some of the lessons you've learned for those of us in biomedical research where standardization is pretty much non-existent, unfortunately?
Well, in a funny way, there's HL7 and there are other things that you know about. I'm sure many of you must know as well. I would say that standardization is really important, not only for classifying the information that we have so that we know when we have pieces of information that are related. It also creates, as you suggested, interoperability among systems. Standards also have an interesting, potentially hazardous component to it. Let me try to explain what that is. In our healthcare system, we have healthcare HMOs, health management organizations. We have insurance companies. The way the healthcare system in the U.S. works is that when the patient comes to see the doctor, if the doctor wants to be compensated by one of the healthcare systems, they have to assign a particular code to either the visit, the diagnosis, or the treatment. Now, that standardization is there to help, I guess, assess what the value of the treatment was or what the accuracy of the diagnosis was and whether or not it all meets the standards of care. But it also has this very peculiar property that it pigeonholes and shoehorns things into particular diagnoses. And that seems like it's the antithesis of medicine that takes into account the person and the person's specifics. Now, I'm not a doctor, and I could have just said something not very precise, but it feels to me like that standardization, which is there for reasons that we can understand in the financial business and everything else, interferes with our ability to deliver health care in, I'm going to use the word personalized way. So we have to figure this out better than we have so far, because we want people, and we want doctors especially, to be able to treat patients in accordance to the evidence that the patient's condition exhibits. And we're not there. Our standard of care is too standardized.
Boy, you have hit perfectly one of the most difficult problems in all of electronic health record data collection, and that is the thing we call the problem list, which every clinician out there will tell you the problem list is a mess. You know, some diagnosis will get put on that list and it never leaves. Never leaves the list, and it might not even be true, and in fact often is not. So it's one of the biggest issues we have that you've hit right away.
Well, you're telling me that I hit on something that I don't understand, because when you said it's on the problem list, help me understand what is it that gets something onto a list that you call a problem list? What's the problem?
Some clinician has the patients come in and they've said, you have hypertension.
Okay.
It goes on the problem list.
I mean, this is the list of problems that the patient has.
Okay. Not that I have. No.
Thank you. Okay, now I understand.
There are lots of those problems.
And this is the thing that's stitched on your forehead now.
And then forever, that person is labeled, and it may be that they came in and they got really nervous and excited because this doctor terrified them, so their blood pressure was high.
And their blood pressure was up. And
hypertension is on their diagnosis list forever.
Wow, okay. So you triggered another reaction for me anyway. I think someday I want to write an essay called "You Are Not Your Disease." And I don't mean to offend any doctors in the house here, but I think some doctors have a tendency to think of their patients as the disease as opposed to the patient. And that's part of the problem list.
Yeah. Perfect. Okay, we have another question for someone. At NIH, we definitely believe in the power of unleashing information. For a little over a year now, we've had a new data management and sharing policy that requires every investigator and institution who receives funding from the NIH to plan for how they will share their data and how they will not only share their data, but manage their data so that it can be shared. So what are some of the roadblocks that you foresee in getting usable data from researchers? And how do you recommend we overcome those difficulties?
Man, how many hours do we have? I mean, this is
a
hard problem. First of all, is the data that they have commensurate with any other data? How will we be able to label it in such a way that even the units of data, I mean, it's a number. Okay, 25. Well, is that 25 pounds or 25 ounces or, something else? 25 kilograms? So first of all, we have to figure out how to make sure we have common labels for the data, or we have to translate it into something that everybody will understand in common. So that's problem number one. Second, there could be a lot of it. Mm-hmm. And so when you tell somebody you have to figure out how to share your data, we had better have in mind something to tell them to help them do that. If somebody says, I'm happy to do it, but I don't know how, I don't know where to put it. There's more of it than I know, than I can afford to store away. So you have to overcome scale. You have to overcome semantics of the data and standardized representations. And, oh, by the way, we didn't even get to the other hard part, which is preserving it over periods of time. Fortunately, our lifetimes are getting longer, but what that means is that the data about us, our health data, should be preserved over the entire lifetime because it could tell us a great deal towards the end of our lives about what problems may have arisen, but they may have had origins much earlier. It might even have been analytically detectable. Mm. So, holding on to that data over a long period of time, digital preservation is a big challenge. It used to be that we wrote our stuff on little clay tablets in cuneiform, and that was 6,000 years ago. And the funny thing is that those tablets are still around. And if you can read cuneiform, that's a bit of not too common. But they were warehouse records, and the warehouses burned down and baked the clay, so the clay lasted 6,000 years. And then there was vellum, and calf skin and the like, and that lasts a couple thousand years, amazingly. But it's only a couple thousand compared to 6. And then comes rag paper, which lasts 500, 600 years, and we're getting worse and worse at storing our information. So how many people have 3.5-inch floppy disks or 5.25-inch floppy disks? And even if the bits are still there, do you have a reader that can read it? So one of the big problems associated with your question is not only the format and the commonality and standardization, but it's also how the hell do I preserve all that digital information long enough and at scale. So that's where companies like Google, are hard pressed to increase the total amount of ability to store information.
It's a tough problem.
But I love that problem. I mean, scale is fun to tackle. Make it bigger.
Well, I still have all my old laboratory notebooks where, with all the writing in them, but I also have some 3-inch floppy disks. And my laboratory notebooks I can still read.
I appreciate that problem.
Everything that's on those disks.
So the difference, though, is that you can read the lab notebooks, but the computer might not be able to read them.
Correct.
And if you wanted to exercise the kind of tools that we've been talking about, we need to turn that into digital information.
Okay. NIH is invested in advancing point-of-care technologies, which help meet people where they are, where they live, where they work, including in their own homes. And we also have a critical need. We have trust issues with our patients, the people we're trying to serve. So we also want to involve people more in their own decision-making and in self-care, as well as in the research process. So this can include devices that connect to the internet and health systems, the Internet of Things. How do you think the Internet of Things devices can improve healthcare?
Well, first of all, there's no doubt in my mind that they can. Part of the reason for this, again, goes back to my earlier observation that being able to observe the patient 24 hours a day for days on end or weeks or months means that we can calibrate that patient's condition relative to that which is being measured. That's really important. We can do alerts and things like that if we see some variation that is extreme, for example. So building a model of an individual patient based on that kind of data is really quite attractive. Some of you have probably worn recording devices, for example, that strap to your waist for a period of days or even weeks. That information could be collected more readily by what we call wearables at Google. Your wristwatch can pick up a lot. It's amazing how much you can tell by sticking something in your ear. I mean, I don't know if that sounds kind of silly, but it's true. There's a lot of the body's condition is literally detectable inside the ear canal. So I can easily imagine wearing devices that help us keep track of and warn us if there's something happening. Those of you who either are or know about diabetics that have glucose detectors and have automatic detection and in some cases automatic injection of insulin in order to respond to the current state of glucose will know that those devices are really quite effective. Now we worry a lot, I do anyway, about the correct operation of the device. So whatever software is involved in those devices absolutely has to be rigidly tested and checked and validated and everything else. But I see the monitoring of sensory information as a very important future for our ability to provide better health care. Can I just mention that I was in Saudi Arabia recently and visited a virtual hospital where the patients are remote, but they have locally in their homes and on their person sensory devices that allow a doctor at the central virtual hospital to gather their data and have discussions and video calls and so on with the patients so that they can get health care that they wouldn't otherwise get because there are no clinics that are locally available. And there are things that are starting to happen. Example, sonography. Sonograms are becoming much more reliable as diagnostic tools. I sound like I know what I'm talking about, which is really amazing. It sounds like I'm a large language model in person here. So the sonogram resolution has gotten much, much better, and those are less expensive than an fMRI or MRI-type machines or even CT scanners. So I see these kinds of small portable devices as being a significant improvement in our ability to diagnose illness and to track health states.
And soon.
Yes.
Yeah, this isn't the future, this is here now.
This is now.
Yeah, okay. All right, I think these are getting harder. Misinformation, disinformation, and declining trust remain huge challenges for the scientific community, especially for government scientists. Do you think this is getting better or worse? Do you think this will get better or worse in the future? And how do you think we can combat the problem and devise solutions to misinformation? I told you it's getting harder.
You don't have to have another question, do you?
I do. We can skip that.
No. I will not duck that because that's a really important problem. So there are several things that we're going to have to do. First of all, with regard to information at all, provenance of the information is increasingly important. We have to know where stuff comes from. We haven't done as good a job as I think we are going to have to do in order to identify where things come from. Even if we know where they come from, then we have to assess whether or not they come from a source that we care to trust or not. Maybe it's a source that we have trusted and then suddenly we have to decide that we don't anymore because the information has become polluted. For some kinds of misinformation and disinformation, there is a defense. It's called critical thinking. And it takes a fair amount of work to do that, and a lot of people are unwilling to do the work to think critically about what they see and hear. I actually think that young people should be trained to think critically, that they should be encouraged and congratulated for thinking critically about what they see and hear. Now, there are some parents that don't like to hear that because the kid might come home and disagree with their parents, and some parents don't take that too lightly. On the other hand, I think that's how you have to cope with a world where some information is not to be trusted. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done to label information, to identify trusted sources, and frankly use critical thinking. Every once in a while I think that how you have to take a test before you get your driver's license? I've often thought that people should have an internet driver's license test where you have to learn about the hazards of being on the internet road. And that there are parties out there on the real roads that don't know how to drive very well, and there are people on the virtual roads that don't have truth at their fingertips. And you need to understand that and figure out how to be defensive about that. Our scientists especially, though, have to be skilled in this art, because otherwise they will ingest bad information, which will lead to bad diagnoses and bad treatments.
So who regulates all this? How do we make this happen? And let me back up to where we were before about, the internet. Someone had to decide this is the standard we're going to use, because there's always competition for these things. And somebody has to say, okay, enough silos, we're going with this one. Mm-hmm. Things like this. Okay, we've had this free and open and nobody knows where this comes from. Now we need to see an identifier that needs to be, who should be setting, what organization, how should these standards come about?
Okay, that is a hard question.
I know.
Well, first of all, there is increasing attention being paid to identity in this environment. And some of us think that you could have a distributed collection of parties who would verify your identity. And let me use that word in a very broad sense, verify the origin of information. No, this is back to thinking about where do things come from? What is their provenance? So having a party that can verify a source, and then having a way for that source to label the information that the source has provided so we can trace it back to the source. Just to borrow that term for a moment, traceability is something that the National Institutes of Standards and Technology are very big on traceability. What they mean by that is that the scale at the store where you weigh the pound of bananas has been calibrated against the standard. And you can trace that all the way back to the standards, physical standards that NIST maintains. And so that traceability is our friend there because we can trust the instruments that are doing the weights and measures. That's how the National Bureau of Standards originally started. So the same argument might be made for information. If we can identify the origin of the information, just because we know where it came from doesn't necessarily mean that it's correct or accurate, but at least we know where it came from. And in terms of who would provide that kind of validation, you can imagine, just as we have generally accepted accounting practices, and we have companies that do audits, you can imagine having generally accepted identity practices that some companies would be certified to provide that label so that you could use a cryptographic signature, so to speak, on the content that you're trying to establish as valid. So I think it doesn't have to be centralized necessarily, but there have to be standard practices that we all agree to and we have to agree to be audited with regard to our exercise of those standards. And maybe that's a place to start.
Well, the scientific method, grounded in science and grounded in research, certainly for medicine, is our standard, right? And
Yeah, but you remember that the scientific method it's beautiful. I mean, there's something utterly elegant about this. It starts out by saying you have observations and you try to figure out what could possibly have produced that observation. You get a theory, and then you test the theory if you're a good scientist. And then, if the data that you collect doesn't match what the theory predicted, then you have to admit the possibility that your theory is wrong. That's really hard for some scientists. This is my theory. I've been working on this for 25 years. And your instrumentation is broken. Now, sometimes that's actually true.
Right.
Some of you may remember reading about at CERN, where somebody thought that the photons were going faster than the speed of our neutrinos were going faster than the speed of light. Well, there was a little instrumentation problem because some connector wasn't connected properly, and there was some delay that wasn't supposed to happen. But sometimes the measurements really do tell us that our theories are wrong. This is the beauty of the scientific method if we're good about it. There is one other thing to observe here, and that has to do with measurement itself. Some of the most fundamental things in science come about because we've suddenly been able to measure something we couldn't measure before. Think about DNA sequencing. Something we could not measure before, we can now measure. Think about some of the other things that we can measure now that we couldn't before. One of the most interesting questions any scientist, and maybe even any doctor, could ask is, what is it that I can't measure now that if I could measure would make a big difference in my understanding of disease or in my treatment of patients?
There are millions of questions, millions of things that we can't measure now that are going to eventually allow us to treat patients better.
So, well, the important thing would be to figure out which of those things we don't know how to measure right now.
Right.
We should try to tackle first. And, to give an example of something that was really amazing, at NSF, there was this LIGO experiment, the Laser Interferometer Gravity Observation. It was a 40-year project. When it was first proposed, the scientists who proposed it knew that if they built the machine, it wasn't going to work. But they had to build it to find out how far off the measurement was, to figure out what it was they had to change in order to get better measures. They went through 3 cycles of design and implementation, each one getting closer and closer, better refinement, more accurate measurement, until finally, a few years ago, one of them was in test mode, and it detected 2 black holes circling each other and colliding 1 billion light years away. And that was an unmistakable signal. And fortunately, there were 2 such machines, and the second one also detected the same signal. And there was nothing messy about it at all. I mean, it was a perfect trace of what you would predict from in terms of the gravitational fluctuation. So that's an example where we knew that we couldn't measure something, but we knew that we had to build something to find out how far off we were. That's probably going to be true for a lot of other things.
Well, it sounds like artificial intelligence to me.
Well, that's certainly a thing which is not working the way we would like it to, and so we know we have work to do. Yeah. Good point.
Fair enough. Okay. Yeah. What advice do you have for those here who are just starting their scientific careers?
Well, let's see. The stock answer that I have to that is you should go into astrophysics. and well, I'll explain. There's a rationale for that. 100 years ago, we thought that we knew pretty much how the universe worked. We had this great Newtonian model, and it made great predictions, and all we figured, well, if we just measure the constants more accurately, we'll be able to predict everything. And then Einstein comes along, and he blows the whole thing up. And then the quantum people come along, they blow up Einstein, And then, at this point now, 100 years later, we know less about the universe than we thought we did 100 years ago. We know about 5% of the universe is normal matter. That includes antimatter. And then 70% is dark energy. What's that? I don't know. But it's causing the expansion of the universe, and it's accelerating. This is sort of WTF. And then, and then there's 25% is dark matter. Oh, I'm sorry, did I say it wrong? It's dark energy is 70%. Dark matter is other stuff. What's that? We don't know. So we know about 5%. So if you go into astrophysics and you do anything, the chances of a Nobel Prize are sky high. So honestly, I mean, to be fair about an answer here, if I were young, at this time, not obviously, but if I were young, I think I would want to get deeper and deeper into microbiology. I have become utterly fascinated by how complicated cells are. And I used to think a cell was this little bag full of chemicals and they bumped into each other and stuff happened. Well, then I got a hold of the microchemistry of the cell, that big 1,700-page thing, and discovered that the cell was about as complicated as downtown Manhattan. And there's all kinds of stuff going on in there. Mm-hmm. There's these little microtubules, and there are these little protein things that walk along the tubules carrying other proteins that are labeled just like packets in the internet, and they get delivered to the right place inside the cell. I mean, it's somebody from UC San Diego sent me a note saying, "Hi, there's an internet inside the cell." I said, "What are you talking about?" And they talked to me about exactly that. So, man, that would be so damn much fun. I would love to do that.
Okay, so we're now getting to the second most popular question received from all of you. 159 upvotes for this one.
This one called, "What Were You Thinking?"
Yeah. This one's pretty practical, though. How do we ensure, for biomedical research, the broad and appropriate representativeness of the data being used to train our models, given the historical inequities of large data collection?
So this is really hard because we know we have enormous diversity in this world, but not everyone in this diverse globe has access to medical care that would capture the data in the first place. And so the important thing is what you just did, which is to recognize that we don't have that data and that we should take steps, if we possibly can, to get that data. So it may be as the cost of gathering information about people's health gets less and less and more affordable and more feasible and more supportable, we may be able to get more people willing to contribute data about the way their bodies work or are working. In fact, let me make a general observation. Sometimes you take the biggest and most expensive technology and it's only used by people that can afford it. How about computing? In the early days, only very big companies could afford to have a computer, and they were so proud of it they put it in a glass-walled room and said, "Look, we have computers and you don't." Well, now we have them in our pockets. I have one in my ear. And so it becomes smaller, less energy dependent, and affordable. And so many technologies have that characteristic. So one thing we can do is to try to recognize exactly the problem that you said and look for ways of gathering that data at lower and lower cost, trying to provide benefit to a larger and larger population and accumulate as much data as we can to build better models. But it has to be something that we consciously decide to do.
Yeah. Well, and I will add to that we also recognize that segments of our society for whom we have the least data are also the ones with the worst outcome, who are also the ones that have least trust in many ways. And so we've got a social problem.
Yes.
Science isn't going to fix this.
No.
It's the only thing that's going to fix this is the human-to-human interaction and the earning trust, not earning trust?
Well, social and economic response is needed. This is a lot of the problems that we see are a consequence of being in a lower socioeconomic layer than others, and so we have to recognize that. So your point's extremely well taken, and all we can do is show by our deliberate action that we are trustable.
Okay, so this one should be easy. In what ways could technology like ChatGPT and BARD be leveraged, as they are there, be leveraged to improve medical research and patient care? And if they are used there, what measures need to be taken to ensure the accuracy and reliability of the information generated?
Well, I'm going to borrow from one of my distant relatives. At least we think we were related, Bennett Cerf. And somebody will remember Bennett Cerf and What's My Line and Random House and the fact that he never met a pun that he didn't like. And he wrote a book called Laughter is the Best Medicine. And my reaction right now is that maybe we should use BARD and Gemini and ChatGPT for its laughter element more than anything else. It's great medicine. They are generally not yet ready for prime-time diagnostics or anything like that, or even medical advice. Let me set aside the large language model, which is the question you asked, and argue that it's not ready to be helpful to us other than for, I would say, entertainment. It does do, let me be fair about this. There is one thing for sure that the large language models have been able to do, which I find astonishing, and that's language translation, speech understanding, speech synthesis. It's astonishing how well these models work. And I use them all the time because I get email from all over the world, and a lot of it is not in the language that I speak. You know, the translations are not perfect, but the large language models have their utility. But machine learning tools, which are not large language models, may very well be our strongest avenue to analyzing large quantities of data, looking for correlations, and then trying to understand whether there is an explanation for what those correlations exhibit. And this is why my friend Judah Perl at UCLA, who is another Turing Award winner, wrote two books. One of them was called The Book of Why, and the other one was called Causality. And his point is that unless you have a causal model, having correlations doesn't give you much insight. So I believe that the machine learning tools can, in fact, help us ingest and look for correlations, at which point we now can start asking ourselves serious questions about what possible model could produce that correlation, and does that give us insight into metabolism and the way in which bodies work.
Okay. What are the biggest challenges in ensuring the reliability and validity of AI and machine learning algorithms in healthcare, and how can we address those challenges?
Well, you've already implied several ways in which to do that. One of them is to deliberately set about collecting the data that we know we need and don't have, as from the cohorts that don't get adequate attention, for example. And then proceed. You also suggested, for example, that we provide incentives not only to patients but to doctors and to researchers for collecting and sharing their data, for providing them with the tools for doing that, for providing them with standards so that the data is commensurate. All of those things are steps that NIH is in a unique position to take, I think, to show light, in dark corners. So, and I have the sense that you want to do that. So I would encourage that, and I hope the legislators understand that this is an important way forward.
Related. Given your experience with the evolution of the internet and digital technologies, what are the ethical considerations and secondary privacy concerns do you think we should all be thinking about as we prioritize machine learning to become integrated into healthcare?
Oh, that's an interesting kind of sandwich that you just put together, because
Right.
you started out with the internet and then you ran off onto the machine learning stuff. The internet is not a machine learning system except in one or two senses. The routing system, for example, figuring out how the packet should go through the network, could be helped with machine learning tools, and we use those. But the internet itself is basically simply a mechanism for transmitting digital information from one place to another. But then you get to layer a bunch of stuff on top of that. When Tim Berners-Lee invented the World Wide Web, he put a layer of protocol on top of the TCP/IP work that Bob Kahn and I did in order to build what we now think of as the World Wide Web. I'm trying to figure out how. Okay, so you mentioned ethical concerns. This is the place where some people come up and say, it's all your fault. What were you thinking? Look at all the bad stuff that happens. And my reaction to this is, well, wait a minute. People sometimes take tools that have been invented for constructive reasons and they use them for other than constructive purposes. A hammer can pound a nail and it can pound a head. So I kind of resist being accused of I could be accused, along with my colleagues, of enabling some bad behaviors because, honestly, we tried to reduce the barrier to access to information to a minimum. That meant reducing the barrier for sharing information to a minimum, reduce the barrier to finding information to a minimum, all of which has had very positive benefit, but it's also created an opportunity to spread misinformation and disinformation. But the decision to do that, for the most part, is someone's decision. It's not the network that's deciding to do that. So I think we have to hold parties responsible for bad behavior, which translates into accountability. And I would say that what is missing from the environment that we're in right now is a sufficient degree of accountability for decisions that are made. And in order to have accountability, you have to have the ability to identify. Now, here's where we get into a real tension, because some people will say, well, my privacy is important to me. I don't want to be known when I'm using these tools. And you can understand why some people might say that. And some people are at real risk if they were identifiable. But even if you invoke the whistleblower scenario, which is a common one to justify privacy and anonymity, usually the whistleblower blows the whistle to someone who has to figure out who they are in order to know whether they're credible, but who is responsible for protecting their identity. Reporters go to jail sometimes in the protection of the sources that they choose. So I think in the long run, absolute anonymity is not our friend in this online environment, and that we have to have a way of piercing the veil under the right circumstances, with the right authorities. Just like license plates, they look like gobbledygook to us, but some people, the police, have the ability to find out which owner is associated with that license plate. That isn't necessarily the driver of the car that just went 120 miles an hour down the road, but at least you identify the owner of the car, and that's a start. So I think that these are all things, accountability is really important. Now there's one other thing that's equally important, and that's agency, in the sense that we need to give people the tools to protect themselves, to protect their privacy, to use these systems without revealing any more than they absolutely have to in order to legitimately use it. Like sometimes you have to pay for things, so that means you have to share your credit card information. If you don't want to do that, you may not get access to what it is that you're trying to get. So agency and accountability, I think, are going to be our friends here as we try to move forward.
So this takes that a little bit of a different direction, but I think it's an important question. So we have lab tests. A lab test, there's a governing, approving agency that says this test is safe, this test is reproducible. You know, it performs
Yeah.
the same on samples every time. It can safely be used in a clinical environment to make decisions for people, CLIA, approval of labs, etc. Do we need the same kind of knowledgeable regulatory agency or body for machine learning and AI-built tools and technologies?
So I actually would suggest that we should expand rather than contract here. And I would say, generally speaking, for software, whether it's AI or machine learning or any other kind of software, there should be thoughtful ability to audit the safety and security of that software, whether it was AI or machine learning or anything else. Because we're so darn reliant on software now. I mean, the thing in your pocket, the mobile, when it doesn't work, it's cascade failure time. All kinds of things cause you trouble. So the idea of having standards for developing reliable, safe, and secure software, including AI and machine learning, makes a lot of sense. Now, in the accounting world, there's something called generally accepted accounting principles. Yeah. And maybe we need to have generally accepted software principles, or maybe generally accepted, that's gas, and generally accepted AI principles, which doesn't pronounce very well. But I think that we should be looking for principles that we can all adopt and apply in the development and use of these kinds of technologies. But I want to emphasize something here. It's the use that's important here. The risk factors have to do with the way these technologies are applied. So it's not the specific detail of a neural network that is at issue here as much as it is the decision to use that system for a particular application. So if I use a chatbot just for entertainment, that's a relatively low-risk thing, unless you get into a big argument over intellectual property and where did the information come from for training the model. That we can have quite a long conversation about that. But when you start to get up into applications where we're saying, we're going to use this thing to give you financial advice, or we're going to do diagnosis of your symptoms, or we're going to make recommendations for treatment, boy, oh boy, are you ever in high-risk territory there. So how do you demonstrate to a body which is going to audit your practice that you have taken prudent steps to protect the safety and interest of the party who's going to be following the advice, the diagnosis, and the treatment? So we need to have that kind of audit. Now, I don't know that we are already prepared to lay out what those audit terms should be. But we've had a long time to develop that for accounting. Maybe it's time to get started on the same thing for software and for machine learning and for large language models and generally machine learning and AI. And we just need to start working on that.
Yeah, I suspect we will need to have some oversight for these, just like we do for anything if they end up helping us make clinical decisions. These are life and death decisions.
So
we need to understand and have some kind of qualification system so that it's not the Wild West.
So an interesting question is whether we have any worked examples. We have the Federal Drug Administration, for example,
right,
and they have rules about how we decide whether or not a drug treatment is safe or a test is accurate. NIST helps us with some of those things too, because they help us calibrate whether or not the tests are producing reliable results. So we need something like that. I don't know if it needs to be centralized exactly, but we do have to have a common set of agreed practices, because we'd like to be able to rely on whoever is providing those products and services to have met the same certification standards.
Right. And if these things are regulated as devices, it will be a very different situation than if they are. Some of the challenges we have in the device world, that it hasn't been solved there yet.
Well, the interesting thing about devices these days is that most of them have a lot of software in them.
Exactly.
And so that's why I get nervous about software in general,
Right.
is that we really need to pay attention to how does this stuff work, and what if it doesn't? What are the edge cases that have to be catered to?
So we're out of time. Wow, that was just wonderful.
Jeez, that went fast.
Yeah. Can you believe that?
No. There's a time warp in here somewhere, right?
But we can't end talking about regulatory procedures. Come on, that's just not fair. So I'm going to give the floor over to you one last time. First of all, I'm going to say thank you for this incredible conversation. We're so grateful you're here for this visit. I couldn't think of a more spectacular Rawls cultural lecture than you are providing for all of us. This has been so thoughtful and inspiring. But I'm going to turn it over to you because we'd love to hear if you have any parting ideas for us.
Well, thank you, first of all, for the opportunity to have this conversation. I will take away a bunch of ideas that I might not otherwise have thought about. So I appreciate the opportunity. I hope those of you who are sitting here in the audience recognize what an opportunity NIH has to improve the state of healthcare, not only here in the U.S. but elsewhere, with the kind of research that you're doing, and the attempt to exercise these powerful computing tools that are emerging. You know, you asked earlier, what would I suggest people study and go into? And I said astrophysics. But generally speaking, something has happened over the past 20 years, and I'll call it computational X for every value of X you can think of. Linguistics, chemistry, physics, economics. We are using computing tools increasingly to build models, to test the models, to try to understand how the world works, make predictions. And NIH is invested heavily in trying to develop those kinds of tools. And you have an opportunity to make a lot of progress, I think, because you're the source of a fabulous research, great data, and now also the potential for using computer-based tools to make your predictions even more precise. So if I were in your shoes, I'd be sitting here thinking, boy, do we have a lot of work to do and a huge amount of opportunity to do good. So thank you for running the show.
Thank you.